come once again to discuss things.
Into it then. Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Geeky Gentleman. I'm Subpart2. Joining me today is the most delicious Geeky Gentleman, Ruben DeBoard.
Hello.
Hey. We are here to do a character discussion because Steve and I have had trouble getting on call to record, so I wanted to make sure we had something for this week, and so Ruben has picked our character this week. Ruben, what are we discussing today?
We are talking about the DC Comics pseudo-superhero Swamp Thing.
I think superhero is a very loose term with Swamp Thing.
Yeah, that's why I said pseudo.
Since he violently murders people.
Yeah, and it's, you know, some of the best Swamp Thing stories are him sitting in a swamp, like, pontificating. So it's hardly a superhero series, but it's because it's set in the DC universe and he pals around with other superheroes that I kind of feel like I can sort of say he is, but then it's, I don't know, it's a gray area or a green area.
That wasn't funny.
What I said or what you did?
Both.
Okay, yeah, fair enough.
Oh, man. No, you're right. It is, like, he does good things in horrific ways to the point where, like, the recent DC animated movie, Batman Harley Quinn, where, like, you got Jason Woodrow, you got Poison Ivy planning to, like, kill the whole fucking human race and all life on Earth to make them plant people, and then Swamp Thing shows up, and, like, he's supposed to be kind of the ultimate justice thing, but then he doesn't do anything, and he just leaves. It's like, yeah, no, he'd probably just be on their side, so I don't even know what the point of having him show up was, because Swamp Thing just violently murders the shit out of people, and everyone acts like he's still a good guy. No. Just no.
Yeah, and it's so weird, like, so Swamp Thing appeared, like, literally, I think, within months. It might have been even the same month as Man-Thing from Marvel, and I'm pretty sure that the co-creator of Swamp Thing and one of the co-creators of Man-Thing at one point were even living in the same apartment, but, like, it was one of those extremely coincidental things where it's like neither one of these guys were copying off each other, but they both kind of created very similar characters that went off in insanely different directions, because, like, Man-Thing I find to be incredibly boring. He's just like a shambling monster with no agency. He just kind of like runs, mopes around, and like if you're scared of him, then you burst into flames because that's the rules apparently. Except if you're a good guy, then you don't. But like Swamp Thing has remnants of his human mind, and that's something that we can get into later, maybe about like how he was portrayed in the 70s versus how he was portrayed in the 80s. But because of that, I feel like he has the capability of being much more interesting because he feels more like a character and less like a really giant, like grass-covered bullfrog with no actual mind, if that makes sense. So, like when you were talking about like going around killing people, it reminded me of like a lot of what I've heard about Man-Thing, where it's just like he just kind of goes around, and then he who knows the fear will burn at the touch of Man-Thing or whatever. But like with Swamp Thing, while he does kill people, I feel like there is a lot of interesting room to take the character, and many creators have.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, it's really, you can do some interesting stuff with Swamp Thing, and it's weird. Have you seen Justice League Action?
A little bit of it. I haven't seen many episodes.
Oh, so you haven't seen any of the episodes of Swamp Thing then?
I feel like he was in one of the ones I saw, but I don't think it was a Swamp Thing-centric episode. So,
okay, because like there's an episode with him where like Poison Ivy is attacking the city and everything, and they're all sure it's Poison Ivy, and then all of a sudden Superman just gets like captured by giant vines, and then out of the grass rises Swamp Thing, and he's holding on to Superman. It's just like this awkward silence where Superman's like, Swamp Thing? Hi, Superman. You're the one behind this? No, it's Poison Ivy. Could you let me go? Oh, sure. Except she's controlling me. It's just like this really awkward like buddy. Like he's so insanely pleasant in that movie or in that series. It's so totally off. So like I feel really weird for the kids that are gonna be watching Justice League Action. Go, oh yay, Swamp Thing! I know that guy. He's really funny and cool. And then they're gonna go read like an Alan Moore Swamp Thing comic where he violently turns someone into a tree, and it's gonna be like traumatizing.
Yeah, and I think Alan Moore I think is a good place to start with the character because he appeared in the early 70s I think, and I've only read like 6 or 7 issues of the Bronze Age Swamp Thing. They just recently, like within the last year, they did an omnibus that I think collects everything pre-Alan Moore. And a lot of that is Lynn Wein, who just died like within the last year or so. And he was I think he was one of the co-creators of the character, but I haven't read everything that's from the 70s. I just read just a little bit of it. And the big, like Alan Moore has talked about before, the big problem with everything before his run was that Swamp Thing was a grass monster that thought that he had, well, the status quo, I guess, was Alec Holland was a scientist who was turned into a grass monster, and then he was trying to turn himself back. And Alan Moore said the problem with that is as soon as he succeeds, you don't have any more story because he's no longer Swamp Thing. And that means he can never succeed. So you're constantly stringing the audience along. And so Alan Moore and
the Hulk television show.
Yeah. Or like he also mentioned, I've seen people mention like Gilligan's Island as an example. Like, they can never get off the island. And then once they do, like they eventually go back to the island. But Alan Moore and I want to say Rick Veidt is the artist who did it with Alan Moore. Did the run with him, that is. But I want to say they were the ones who started that run where in the first arc, Swamp Thing is shot, and then his body... I'm allowed to spoil stuff, right?
Oh, of course.
Okay. He's shot, and then his body is being dissected. I want to say by Jason Woodrue also, and or the Floronic Man. And then
that is the weirdest name.
It is, really. But he... and then he like tells somebody who hired him to do it. He's explaining like, no, Swamp Thing isn't really dead. Like this is just a grass body, but like his essence is going to go and create a new grass body. And that's where he kind of explains that he's not a man who turned into a monster. Like the man died, and that the monster is now like invincible and invulnerable and can't be killed. And I feel like that was the most interesting thing that Alan Moore ever did. And I mean, that's an incredibly interesting run. I haven't read it in about 10 years. I read it when I was in high school, but I have that whole run, and I'm wanting to just sit down and like devour it here in the next month or two. But that I feel like changing the status quo just a little bit so that Swamp Thing is no longer trying to turn himself back into a human just by saying, nope, you can't do it, you're not a human anymore. I think that was a really good direction to take the series.
No, I'd agree. I haven't read the Moore run because I get sick of Alan Moore, so it's hard for me to want to read his stuff. So I haven't read the Moore run, but I've been insanely curious about it over the years. It's another one of those things where like Alan Moore gets all this credit for being such an original writer, but all of his best stuff is based on pre-existing properties.
Yeah.
So I never know what to make of that. But like he definitely has a great voice and a good sense of what direction things should go in, and does a good job with that. And so it doesn't surprise me at all that like he sees the exact problem with Swamp Thing and then finds the way to make it really interesting. Now, is Alan Moore the one that created the concept of the green?
Yes, that was, he and I guess his artistic collaborator. It's one of those things I don't really know who to attribute what to, but it was during his run with, I want to say Rick Veidt was the guy who was doing it with him the entire time. I don't think there were any other artists on the Alan Moore run. But the green, that was one of in the first arc or the second arc. And that also introduced John Constantine, who was kind of very different role there than he later had in his own series and in the DC universe at large. I'm a big King Arthur fan, and so John Constantine was very much a Merlin to Swamp Thing's King Arthur. Like, he was there just to say, this is what's going on. Like, he was there to explain stuff to him. But he was basically there to say, like, you're not the only Swamp Thing. There have been others before. And that was actually something that he was incorporating something from the 70s, because the first Swamp Thing comic was from the very early 70s, but it was set in Victorian times. And then the next Swamp Thing comic was set in the present day. Well, basically, they just ignored that first comic. Well, then Alan Moore said that happened, and it was just part of a long line of Swamp Things, and that was just one of them. But yeah,
so like Swamp Thing's what is it? The it's not vehicle, the Herald of the Green, is that what it's supposed to be? Like, is that what his title is?
Or Avatar of the Green. I'm not
Avatar,
really sure.
That's it. Yeah. Like, that's a really interesting idea, but then it's created this weird thing in Poison Ivy, wherein she's connected to the Green as well. Mm-hmm. And so it's weird to read Poison Ivy, who is supposed to be a villain, and yet, has the exact same motivation and often does a lot of the same things that Swamp Thing does, but Swamp Thing's portrayed as the hero, right?
Yeah. And also, I think you could divide up like two different kinds of Swamp Thing stories, because before the Alan Moore run, he was basically, it was just kind of like a monster movie where the monster is the protagonist, but like he's doing a lot of stuff you're talking about. Like, it's been even longer since I read the pre-Alan Moore stuff, but I do believe there was quite a bit of him. Like, he would meet other monsters, and there'd be monsters created by people, and he'd be fighting stuff in the pursuit of trying to change himself back into a human. And there was a lot of him like committing, not necessarily really violent, because in the 70s, they were just barely, still in the Comics Code Authority days, so they couldn't be too graphic with it. But he'd be, kind of, sort of, not really Punisher, but, I guess Judge, Jury, and Executioner. But I guess in the 80s, you got to where he was more, like, he was willing to do some pretty horrific stuff. Like, there's one very memorable scene in the Alan Moore run where they tried to, Lex Luthor, basically, this group of businessmen, they hire Lex Luthor to kill Swamp Thing, and so he like changes the sonic tune of the planet, basically, so that when they destroy Swamp Thing's current body, his essence is not able to create a new body on Earth, and so it sends him like to the other end of the universe. And then there's several issues where he's jumping from planet to planet trying to get back to Earth. But after that, he's killing all these people who were basically involved in that. And like one guy was eating like a sub sandwich, and there's like a tomato in the sub sandwich, and so Swamp Thing is basically able to like explode that guy from within by making that tomato grow. And so like he does do some pretty horrific stuff. But I think, and I haven't read nearly enough Poison Ivy stuff, and I've never read a Poison Ivy story that specifically says that she's like an agent of the Green. I think it'd be very...
Poison Ivy Cycle, Life and Death, she got a mini-series for a while, and it even has, like, it has her talk about the Green in that, and it even goes so far as to have Swamp Thing show up at a certain point.
Is that fairly new?
Yeah, it's like late New 52.
Oh, okay.
So that's really interesting. But yeah, the horrific murders of the Swamp Thing, like I'd always heard about them, but since I never read the Alan Moore stuff, like I didn't know exactly what it was. But then Tom King's written a couple Swamp Thing stuff lately. So the first time that Tom King wrote Swamp Thing, to my knowledge, is in the one issue, one and done Batman story, The Brave and the Mold, which is an adorable title. Like, I remember when he announced that's what he was going to call it on Twitter, like, goes, I'm writing a Swamp Thing Batman story, The Brave and the Mold, and someone's like, please tell me that's the actual title, and he goes, it is. And it's the funniest thing ever. But, like, in that, Swamp Thing and Batman team up, and Alec Holland's father is killed in the first page or so, and so Batman's investigating the murder, and Alec Holland, as Swamp Thing, joins in the investigation, and because he feels a need to deal with that, but he's still so, he's got that whole duality thing where he's so separate from the acts of man kind of thing, the man's world stuff, So, like, he seems detached enough for Batman to feel comfortable bringing him along on the mission, and they're having, like, a good time palling around, and, like, you know, yada, yada, yada. And then, like, they meet the guy that killed Alan Collins' father, and Swamp Thing just goes crazy and grabs him and, like, forces flowers to grow out of his eyes, and just, like... just brutally murders the fuck out of him right in front of Bruce, and Batman's just like freaking out, and he just screams at Swamp Thing, and Swamp Thing just like realizes that he's totally betrayed Batman's trust and disappears. And so that was really, really horrific to read, and I think Swamp Thing very much falls more into the guise of horror comic than he does superhero comic for those reasons. And then there's the recent one-shot Swamp Thing, the Winter Special that King wrote with Jason Fabok doing the art. And that is just... God damn. Like, Tom King has this ability to just rip your heart right out of your chest, stomp on it, then hand it back to you and go, now pay me money for another story. And you're like, okay. It's just like this whole story of Swamp Thing carrying this child around through this, you know, winter tundra kind of situation, and Swamp Thing's getting weaker and weaker because he can't connect to the green because all the plant life is dead. And then it like gets to the point where Swamp Thing's basically a fucking skeleton of himself, and he like they're running away from this monster that's creating the winter tundra, trying to get to the green so Swamp Thing can regenerate. And just, like, right toward the end of the comic, something goes, I'm sorry, but I can't carry you anymore, to the child. And the kid's like, why not? And something looks at him and goes, 'cause you are the monster. And just, it's the saddest fucking thing ever. You see this real relationship built up between Swamp Thing and this kid, and then Swamp Thing has to murder a child. And it's so completely fucked.
Yeah,
it's just fucked.
I don't even know, and like I say, it's been a while since I've read the Moore stuff, but I don't even know if they would have gone that far in the Alan Moore stuff. I'm gonna assume not.
It's hard to read. It's a good ass story, but it is proper horror with a capital H. It's hard to read, but it's damn well told.
Yeah, and so has Swamp Thing had his own, like, an ongoing series since Scott Snyder at the beginning of the New 52?
I don't believe so. I know the Swamp Thing Winter Special alluded, or they have a printing of Kelly Jones's art for a Len Wein script that was going to be a new ongoing series right before Len Wein died.
Okay.
So, like, that was really interesting because they just published the art that Kelly Jones completed. Like, he completed the whole art for the script before it got back to Len for lettering pass. So they just published the art by Kelly Jones without any dialogue or narration or anything, and kind of let the story speak for itself, and then published Len's original script in the back. So that was an interesting little piece to read and kind of see how much dialogue adds to a piece.
Yeah. That's interesting because I've never read the Scott Snyder stuff. That was right when the New 52 was first beginning. I had like a list of New 52 arcs that I wanted to test out. And I'm just a trade paperback hardcover guy, so I don't read single issues. But I never got around to reading the Scott Snyder stuff because I read the first volume of Animal Man by Jeff Lemire and didn't really like it. And then one thing I didn't like about the very opening of the New 52 was, like, all of these arcs immediately have to cross over with each other. Like, Animal Man is already hinting at a crossover with Swamp Thing. And it's like, you can't even give us a year or two to get used to, like, establish these titles and establish these characters before you're crossing them over with someone else. But so I never did read the Scott Snyder stuff. But from what I understand, I haven't heard a whole lot of talk about the Scott Snyder stuff. So I didn't know if you had read any of that and if you knew what it was, if it was any good.
I've mentioned and talked about them before, my just general dislike or lack of interest in anything Scott Snyder's written. You know,
right.
It's that whole thing of, I read his Batman run and I found it incredibly disappointing, to just put it in the nicest terms I can. And I don't really want to, like, hate Scott Snyder because I've had interactions with him and he's a nice enough guy, and so I don't hate him as a person or anything. I clearly didn't like his Batman, and I've got very little interest in reading anything else by him because of that, you know?
Yeah.
I just, I don't want to just have everything I read just like, I don't like this. Because I'm not interested. I don't have a vendetta against Scott Snyder. I'm very lack of motivation to read anything else by him, you know?
That's understandable, yeah. And I think you and we come from very different ways. Like, you're a pretty big DC Comics fan. I like quite a bit from DC Comics, but we both come at it from very different ways. You, I think, are much more of a fan of stuff in the New 52 and moving forward into Rebirth. I'm more of a fan of Rebirth than I am the New 52. I was really, really down on the New 52. I just didn't really care for most of what I read. And I didn't read
about this so much. Like, I was apparently the only one reading the good books from New 52.
Yeah, well, yeah, I guess so. Because I read OMAC, and I really liked OMAC, and then that one ended. And a lot of it, like, I read the first volume of Demon Knights, and then I just never got around to reading the later volumes. But, like, I read a few volumes here and there, and I'd be like, okay, I like this. Oh, I don't really like that. But there was 52 ongoing series when it first started, and I probably read, like, 10 of the first arcs, and then I would say half of them I was just kind of like, to like, ooh, that's really not good.
Yeah,
but
I don't know. It's crazy. Like me, I was reading Batwing was really great for its opening arc, and then when Lucius Fox took over, it was awful. So I dropped it. Then there was like All-Star Western was one of the best books in the New 52, I promise. The Batman Beyond title was really, really good. Fun, if nothing else, and it was cool to see like all these alternate things from the animated series get to play out. I was the only one ever reading anything good in the New 52. And every book I was reading, I loved it, and it got canceled because no one else was reading it.
I did read All-Star... Well, I read the first arc of All-Star Western, and I really like the idea of Amadeus Arkham teaming up with Jonah Hex.
Right? It's so good. But anyway, back to Swamp Thing.
Yeah. You're more of a newer comic guy, it seems like. Whereas me, if they announced today, like, okay, we're going to do a collection of this series from the 1970s or 80s, I'd be like, ooh, I'm instantly more interested in that than like anything going on today. And that's not meant to be a diss against anyone working today, because there are several characters and creators who I will just about follow them anywhere they go. But I'm always going to be more interested in seeing the roots of those characters from when they first started, and then kind of following them to the present day and seeing how they've changed and evolved. Which is why, I read the Alan Moore run on Swamp Thing a long time ago. Read like the first few issues after Alan Moore left the series. Read like the first 6 or 7 issues of the first Swamp Thing comics. So that's a lot of where my knowledge comes from, and it's interesting hearing you talk about your knowledge, where you're it seems like you're more knowledgeable about the stuff from the last few years. And that's very interesting to me.
Yeah, I don't know. It's one of those things, like, I never really got into... Again, I don't like Alan Moore as a person. Alan Moore I have a vendetta against. I don't like Alan Moore as a person, so I actively choose not to read his stuff, even though I often agree that it's quite good. So I've just never really had much I don't have much of a stake in Swamp Thing as a character, so I've had very little motivation to go read the Alan Moore run. Because, he gets enough credit for being a genius. I don't need to be lending my voice to that incessant choir that just feeds his ego. So, I just no interest in that, no interest in Scott Snyder. I did not like that Jeff Johns made Swamp Thing the avatar of the life entity at the end of Brightest Day. As much as I love Jeff Johns' Green Lantern run, right around the end of Blackest Night is when it starts to run into a lot of problems, that being that Jeff Johns just could not end a story. So like Blackest Night doesn't even end, it just becomes the beginning of Brightest Day. Brightest Day doesn't really end, it just becomes the beginning of the New 52. and it makes Swamp Thing the life entity, and Swamp Thing brutally murders people, so he definitely should not be the life entity. So just all that stuff, I really, really didn't like that, and so I just, that was when I was first getting into current comic books, so that didn't interest me. I just didn't care to read anything with Swamp Thing. And then recently I'm in love with Tom King because he is the second coming, and he likes Swamp Thing, so I'm reading what Tom King writes. It's that thing of, like, there are two ways to discover a character. You know the character, you like the character, so you start reading the book, or a writer or an artist comes on a book and you want to follow their work, so you start reading that character, and then that makes you like the character and start following them maybe independently as well.
Yeah, and I've had that happen with... There have been times where I'm just like, I'm an X-Men fan, and I'll just read the X-Men. And then there are times where, like, I used to be a huge Grant Morrison fan, and I'm not less... Well, I'm not as much of an avid Grant Morrison fan now, but, like, I followed Grant Morrison into series like the Doom Patrol and Animal Man, and really, I kind of saw, like, Doom Patrol, Animal Man, Swamp Thing, and Sandman as, like, the four corners of Vertigo. And when I was, like, in high school, first discovering those series, I was kind of a wannabe pretentious, like, jerk, just like, well, I'm reading Vertigo even though I'm a teenager, but I'm like, I see myself as being more sophisticated and I'm ready to read this stuff. And it's like, I wanted to go back in time and just say, shut up, you're not as smart as you think you are. But it led to me reading a lot of really great comics that probably wasn't, like, emotionally, like, at that level yet. I didn't understand what I was reading in some cases, but coming back to and reading some of it now, I enjoy it quite a bit. But do you, I guess, I don't know if you have an opinion on this, but, like, some of those Vertigo properties, as they kept going, eventually it kind of became an unspoken rule that stuff happening at Vertigo did not take place in the DC universe. So, like, the Sandman, if you read the first volume, he meets
Martian Manhunter and Constantine.
Yeah, and Scott Free, and then later on, like, I don't know, I want to say by the end of the series they were really hesitant to, like, have any DC references there. And then you look at, like, Hellblazer, and Zatanna she shows up in the Constantine, but then, like, I don't think it's supposed to be the same Zatanna that is in the DC universe. And then Brightest Day came along and kind of brings him back into the DC universe. And I don't know, since I haven't read all of Brightest Day, I only read the first volume, I don't know if they're, like, referencing stuff that happened in the Vertigo stuff, or if they're just kind of saying, like, this is Swamp Thing, and here's a very vague recap on his past, but we're not going to, like, reference stuff from the Vertigo stuff. But what do you think of that? Like,
I don't know. For me, like, I never heard that rule until after I'd read a bunch of Vertigo stuff, so I was just like, no, fuck it, it's all in the DC universe. It's just comic books. It's just comic books. Continuity doesn't matter until it's time for continuity to matter. You know?
Right.
That's just what I've always come down to on it. It's like, oh yeah, the writers weren't writing it with the mind of it being in the DC universe, so it's probably going to contradict something somewhere along the line. Guess what? Even when the writers are writing it with the mind of keeping it in this whole cohesive universe, they still contradict shit all the time. It's a massive beast with 1,000 heads. Comic book continuity is the bastard child of 1,000 madmen. So it's just what you get. So I don't put any stock into that. It's saying it's not written with continuity in mind is pretty much saying it's written like a comic book. Because I rarely think that anyone keeps wider DC continuity in mind all that much. That's the editor's job, you know?
Yeah. And I agree. Like, I'll look at continuity. I'll look at a story from 1970, and I'll look at a story from 1990, and I'll look at a story from 2018, and I'll say, like, okay, all these take place in the same continuity in my head, even though they're from 3 different eras of DC Comics. But I'll say, like, these are all really interesting, and it's interesting to me trying to fit them together into one little linear continuity, even though they don't exist that way. But yeah, that's one way. Like, I don't want to say it makes it difficult to read Swamp Thing, but it's interesting, I'll say, because, like, in after Alan Moore's run, it's quite a bit later actually. Grant Morrison and Mark Miller, or Mark Millar, I don't know how to pronounce his name.
Millar.
Millar, okay. They did they collaborated for like 4 issues, and then Grant Morrison kind of slowly, just quietly left the series, and then Mark Millar kept doing it. And I wouldn't necessarily recommend it if you haven't read the Alan Moore stuff, but because it's really following up on some of the stuff Alan Moore introduced. It's saying because Alan Moore, in introducing the Green, there was the Parliament of Trees, and that was all of the previous Swamp Things that were no longer considered themselves part of the world. But then Morrison and Millar, they start this huge arc throughout the entire run of Millar's run, where it's like the Parliament of Waves, the Parliament of Stones, and then there's something else.
That's a very Grant Morrison thing right there. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, it's also fascinating to me because traditionally I do not like Mark Millar's work. Most of the times I'll look at something he wrote and I'm just like, oh, that's not very good. And he does these like, I had a friend of mine, me and him both kind of came to the decision that he is the Michael Bay of comics, where he will just do like loud, explosive, taboo stuff just to try and like get attention. But he is capable of being a really great writer when you look at that Swamp Thing run from the early 90s. And I think Phil Hester was doing the art, and Phil Hester's art, I like it quite a bit, but he does like 2 different kinds of styles, because that Swamp Thing run is very what I traditionally think of as Vertigo style art, like very scratchy and shadowy. But he also does a different style that's very like bright and angular and looks like the DC animated universe stuff. But it's really interesting seeing him do a different style there.
Okay. Well, let's go ahead and go on to recommendations then. We can wrap up. For me, not being a huge Swamp Thing fan, the things I've read are really recent, so I'm going to recommend, it's out in stores now, get the Swamp Thing Winter Special one-shot with Tom King, Jason Fabok, and you get Kelly Jones art, and I mean, you get Kelly Jones Batman, and Kelly Jones Batman is worth every penny. It's just, every time Kelly Jones draws Batman, it's beautiful. So that was really cool. I really like that. Also, the Brave and the Mold one-shot with Tom King and Miss Gerards. Those 2 are the dynamic duo right now. That was a good one. And I like him in Justice League Action, though it's completely, totally off in every conceivable way. Also, his appearance in Justice League Dark was kind of cool for like a whole half a second.
The animated movie?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I still haven't seen that. I've been jumping all over the place with those animated movies.
If you got like time, if you got like an hour to kill, there are worse ways you can spend your time.
Unfortunately, a lot of them have been
Yeah, it was funny. Just this has nothing to do with anything, but like when I first saw the trailer for Justice League Dark on YouTube, the thumbnail was Jon Stewart because he has a brief cameo in that movie as like the normal Justice League shows up to fight. And I'm just like, no, you fucked it up. That's not what Justice League Dark means.
Oh, no. I saw it. This isn't as funny as what you just said, but I saw like trailers for it, and it's like, oh, so it's Batman and every magic user of the DC universe, and we're calling it a Justice League team. I don't know. It may be the best movie ever. I don't know. I haven't watched it, but for me, I guess recommendations, keeping in mind that I haven't read it in a while, and I really hope to reread this run later this year. And I will say, because Ian has mentioned it already in this podcast, I think that Alan Moore can be and has been a despicable person before. He got a little big for his britches there in the 80s and 90s, and then now he just kind of like, he's basically known as being just perpetually grumpy, and anytime he starts to talk about comics, he'll get angry and start, ranting about the industry and stuff. So he is very difficult to stomach. But I also, as Ian mentioned, he doesn't need anybody fanning his ego, but I do think that he's a pretty good writer, and I really like what he did with Swamp Thing. So I would recommend reading that run. For over the last like 5-ish years, they reprinted that run. So I think there's 6 volumes that collects that run. I believe. And then after you've read that, I would recommend reading the Mark Millar run. The first like 4 issues are co-written by Grant Morrison, and that stuff is pretty good. Also, they've done at least 3 pretty big volumes of that run, but I've only read the first 2, I think. Yeah, I've read the first 2, and I have the third one. I just haven't read it yet.
Okay, cool. Ruben, thanks again for doing this, man.
Hey, not a problem.
All right. Everyone, thanks very much for watching. Until next time, I'm the Philosopher.
And I'm the Comics Kid 2099.
And we are your geeky gentlemen. And we will be discussing things.